I was standing on my own front porch, holding 2 garbage bags full of my clothes, while my stepmother stood in the doorway of the house my mother had left me, telling me I had 10 minutes to get off her property before she called the police. I hadn't done anything wrong. I hadn't missed rent, hadn't broken a single rule, hadn't given her a single real reason to throw me out of a home that legally belonged to me, not her. She just wanted me gone, and she'd chosen a day when she thought my father was 3 states away on business, so there'd be no one around to stop her. She didn't know his flight had landed 4 hours early. And she definitely didn't know he was already standing in the driveway behind her, listening to every single word. Welcome back to Betrayal Stories. If you're new here, hit subscribe, because every week we bring you real stories about families, homes, and the moments the truth finally catches up to the people trying to hide it. My name is Natalie Reed, and this is the story of the worst afternoon of my life, and the exact moment my father walked in and changed everything. My mother passed away when I was 14, from an aggressive form of cancer that moved faster than any of us were prepared for, and the house I grew up in, a modest 3-bedroom colonial about 20 minutes outside the city, was the one significant asset she left directly to me in her will, rather than to my father. I didn't fully understand the reasoning behind that decision until years later, when I found out my mother had actually written that will during a rough period in her marriage to my father, a period when trust between them had been genuinely strained, and she had wanted to make certain, regardless of what happened between the two of them romantically, that I would always have a stable, guaranteed place to live that couldn't be affected by however their relationship evolved. The will specified that the house would be held in a trust until I turned 25, with my father serving as trustee and permitted to live there with me in the meantime, but with the actual title transferring fully and irrevocably into my name once I reached that age. My mother, it turned out, had been unusually specific and careful in how she structured that trust, details that would matter enormously later, though at 14, grieving my mother's death, none of that legal architecture registered to me as anything beyond background paperwork. My father, Gerald Reed, remarried about 3 years after my mother passed, to a woman named Vivian Cross, someone he'd met through a mutual friend during a period when I think he was genuinely lonely and still working through his own grief. I want to be fair to my father throughout this story, because I don't think he was a bad man, or even a particularly foolish one. I think he was a grieving widower who wanted companionship again, and who, like a lot of people in that position, saw what he wanted to see in Vivian during their courtship rather than what was actually there underneath. Vivian was, on the surface, warm and engaging during those early years, genuinely charming at family gatherings, attentive to my father in ways that clearly meant a great deal to him after years of navigating single parenthood and grief on his own. I was 17 when they married, old enough to have my own clear-eyed observations about her, but young enough that I still gave her the benefit of the doubt more often than, looking back, I probably should have. The tension between Vivian and me started small, in the ordinary, hard-to-name ways that stepfamily tension often does, small comments about how I organized my room, subtle criticisms about my friend group, a general sense that Vivian saw me less as a person to genuinely get to know and more as an obstacle standing between her and full, unshared ownership of the life she was building with my father. I brought some of these observations to my father over the years, carefully, because I never wanted to seem like I was trying to sabotage his happiness, and he generally responded the way a lot of well-meaning but conflict-avoidant people respond to blended family tension, encouraging me to be patient, to give things time, to understand that new family dynamics take real effort from everyone involved. I moved out for college at 18, which actually improved my relationship with Vivian somewhat, simply because physical distance removed most of the daily friction points that had been building over the previous year. I came home for holidays and occasional weekends, and things were, if not warm, at least civil during those visits. I graduated at 22 with a degree in graphic design, and rather than immediately signing an apartment lease in a job market that was, at the time, genuinely difficult for entry-level positions in my field, my father suggested I move back into the house temporarily while I built up savings and found stable work, an arrangement that made complete practical sense, especially given that the house, legally, was already set to become fully mine within 3 years anyway. I want to explain the financial dynamics of that living arrangement clearly, because they matter enormously to what eventually happened. I paid a modest amount of rent to my father each month, an amount we'd agreed on together that was well below market rate but that I insisted on paying anyway, because I didn't want to feel like I was simply freeloading during this transitional period of my life. I also covered my own groceries, my own portion of utilities, and generally tried to be as unobtrusive and self-sufficient a housemaid as possible, precisely because I could sense, even then, that Vivian's tolerance for my presence in that house had a fairly thin margin. The real trouble started about a year into that arrangement, when my father's business began requiring significantly more travel, extended trips lasting a week or sometimes 2, overseeing a new manufacturing partnership his company had entered into overseas. These trips left Vivian and me alone in the house together for stretches of time that had never really occurred before, since previously, my father's presence had always provided a kind of buffer, however unconscious, that kept whatever underlying tension existed between Vivian and me from ever fully surfacing. Without that buffer, Vivian's true feelings about my presence in the house became much harder to disguise. Small comments turned into pointed ones. She started making passive remarks about how she was looking forward to the house finally feeling like her own, comments that landed with particular weight given that I knew, even if she perhaps didn't fully register, that the house legally belonged to me, not to her or even fully to my father, a fact I don't think Vivian ever took the time to genuinely understand or accept. About 2 months before everything came to a head, I discovered, entirely by accident, that Vivian had been going through some of my mail, specifically bank statements that I still had delivered to the house address out of simple habit rather than any deliberate decision. I found several of these statements in the recycling bin, opened, and when I gently asked Vivian about it, she brushed it off, claiming she'd opened them by mistake, thinking they were addressed to her, an explanation that didn't hold up well against the fact that my name was printed clearly on every envelope. I mentioned this incident to my father during one of his brief calls home from his overseas trip, and he told me, somewhat distractedly given the demands of his own work travel, that he'd talk to Vivian about it when he got back, a promise that, in the moment, felt reasonably reassuring but that, in retrospect, was part of a broader pattern of my father consistently deferring difficult conversations with Vivian to some future point that kept getting pushed further and further back. The actual incident that this story centers on happened on a Thursday afternoon, during what was supposed to be a 2-week business trip for my father, one of his longest stretches away yet. I had just gotten home from a full day at my design job, tired in the ordinary way you're tired after a long workday, when I found Vivian waiting for me in the living room, 2 garbage bags already sitting by the front door, bags I recognized immediately as containing clothes and belongings from my bedroom. Vivian told me, in a tone that I can only describe as coldly matter-of-fact, that she had decided it was time for me to move out, that I was 24 years old and it was, in her words, past time for me to build my own independent life rather than continuing to live under her roof. I remember the specific phrase she used, under her roof, landing with a particular, disorienting wrongness, given that the roof in question was, legally, going to become entirely mine within roughly 10 months, a fact Vivian either didn't fully understand or had simply decided didn't matter in that moment. I told her, as calmly as I could manage given how blindsided I felt, that this was actually my house, that my mother had left it to me directly, and that I didn't think Vivian had any legal authority to remove me from it. Vivian's response to this was dismissive in a way that genuinely stunned me, telling me that whatever paperwork my mother had arranged years ago didn't change the reality of who actually lived in and maintained that house day to day, and that as far as she was concerned, my father's marriage to her gave her every right to decide who did and didn't belong in that home. She told me I had 10 minutes to gather anything I hadn't already packed and get off the property, or she would call the police and report me for trespassing, a threat that felt genuinely surreal to hear directed at myself, standing in the home I had grown up in, the home that legally, unambiguously belonged to me. I remember my hands actually shaking as I picked up those 2 garbage bags she'd already prepared, my mind racing through options, whether to call my father immediately, whether to call a lawyer, whether to simply refuse to leave and see if she'd actually follow through on calling the police over what would have been, legally, an obviously baseless claim. I made it to the front porch, garbage bags in hand, Vivian standing in the doorway behind me, still talking, still listing reasons why this was, in her mind, both reasonable and overdue, when I heard a car pull into the driveway behind me. I turned, expecting perhaps a neighbor or a delivery, and felt something between relief and shock wash over me as I recognized my father's rental car, and my father himself, stepping out of it, his travel bag still slung over one shoulder, his expression already shifting from simple confusion at the scene in front of him into something much harder as he pieced together, in real time, exactly what he was walking into. I later learned that his overseas meetings had wrapped up nearly 4 days ahead of schedule, and rather than sending an email to update his travel plans, which frankly wasn't unusual for him given how erratic his schedule often became during these trips, he'd simply decided to surprise us both by coming home early, catching an earlier flight and driving straight from the airport without calling ahead. I don't think Vivian heard the car pull in until my father was already close enough to have heard a significant portion of what she'd just said to me, because her face, when she turned and saw him standing there, went through a rapid, visible collapse of composure that told me immediately she understood exactly how badly this moment had just turned against her. Ian following behind us, her composure clearly cracking further with every passing minute as she began to understand that the confrontation she'd planned for a moment when she believed no witnesses would be present had instead unfolded directly in front of the one witness whose opinion mattered most. My father sat both of us down in the living room and asked Vivian, calmly but with an edge I had genuinely never heard from him before, to explain exactly what had happened and why. Vivian's explanation shifted several times over the course of that conversation, moving from claims that this had simply been a spontaneous, poorly worded moment of frustration, to eventually, under my father's persistent, calm questioning, an admission that she had, in fact, been planning to have me out of the house before he returned from his trip, specifically because she knew he would likely object to the confrontation if he'd been present for it. That admission changed something in my father's expression permanently, I think. He asked her directly whether she understood that the house legally belonged to me, not to either of them, a fact he confirmed he had explained to her clearly, more than once, over the years of their marriage. Vivian's response, that she understood the technical paperwork but felt that as his wife, she should have equal say over who lived in their home, revealed something my father seemed to genuinely, finally absorb in that moment, not as an isolated incident, but as the clearest possible articulation of an attitude that had apparently been building, unaddressed, for years. My father told Vivian, in front of me, that what had happened that afternoon was completely unacceptable, not just because of the legal reality of the house's ownership, but because of the fundamental disrespect it represented toward both his daughter and toward the memory of my mother, whose careful planning for my future Vivian had just dismissed as irrelevant paperwork in a moment of anger. He told her that trust, once broken this significantly, wasn't something that could simply be smoothed over with an apology and a return to normal routine. The weeks following that afternoon were difficult, in ways that extended well beyond the initial confrontation itself. My father, I learned over the following months, began quietly reassessing significant parts of his marriage to Vivian, not solely because of the porch incident itself, but because that incident had apparently opened his eyes to a pattern of small, dismissive behaviors toward me that he'd been unconsciously smoothing over or excusing for years, in the same way he'd excused the earlier mail incident, in the same way he'd deferred so many smaller conflicts to some future point that never quite arrived. My father and Vivian separated about 4 months after that afternoon on the porch, a decision my father told me, during a long conversation we had shortly after he moved into a temporary apartment, that had been building for far longer than that single incident, but that the incident had finally given him the clarity and the courage to actually act on, rather than continuing to hope things would gradually improve on their own. I want to be honest that I didn't feel simple triumph watching my father's marriage end, even given everything that had happened. I felt a complicated mixture of relief, genuine sadness for my father navigating another difficult transition in his life, and a kind of quiet vindication that the years of small, hard-to-articulate tension I'd experienced with Vivian had finally been seen clearly, by the one person whose validation mattered most. Rather than continuing to be dismissed as ordinary stepfamily friction that would simply resolve itself with enough patience. I turned 25 about 6 months after that afternoon, and the house transferred fully and officially into my name, exactly as my mother had arranged it years earlier, back during a period of her own marriage when she'd had the foresight to protect my future regardless of how the adult relationships around me might eventually shift and change. I still live in that house today, the same rooms I grew up in, now genuinely and completely my own, in every sense of the word, legal and otherwise. My father and I are closer now than we've been since before my mother passed away, closer, I think, because that afternoon forced a kind of honesty between us that years of smaller, avoided conversations had never quite managed to produce. He visits often, and we've talked, more than once, about that day on the porch, about how close I came to actually being pushed out of my own home before he happened to arrive at exactly the right moment to stop it. I think about my mother a great deal when I think about this whole story, about the quiet foresight she showed, years before any of this happened, in making sure that whatever else changed in our family, whatever new marriages or new dynamics eventually formed around me, I would always have a guaranteed, protected place to stand. She couldn't have known, specifically, that a stepmother would one day try to force me out of that exact house. But she understood, deeply and correctly, that protecting my future required more than just hope that everyone around me would always act with good faith. It required actual, careful, legal structure, built years in advance, the kind of protection that turned out to matter more than either of us could have imagined at the time she wrote it into her will. If you've ever been protected by a decision someone made for you long before you ever needed it, or if you've ever watched someone's true character reveal itself at exactly the wrong moment for them and exactly the right moment for you, I want to hear about it. Tell me your story in the comments below. And if this story kept you hooked from beginning to end, make sure you subscribe to Betrayal Stories so you never miss the next one. We've got a lot more coming, and some of these stories will surprise you just as much as this one did. See you in the next video.